Usually when you check into a hotel on a one-night business trip, your expectations are pretty standard.
Yeah, a clean bed, maybe a decent continental breakfast if you're lucky.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in the spring of 2018, when Bill Browder arrived at the Grand Hotel Inglés in Madrid, the manager practically tripped over himself to offer this surprise upgrade to the presidential suite.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we're talking a white living room, tasteful, modern furniture, a whole spread of Spanish cheeses, and Iberico ham, and a private library, a glass-topped bar, even a freestanding bathtub in the bedroom.
That's quite the upgrade.
It was lavish. It was the kind of room you expect a billionaire or a mob boss to stay in.
Which really highlights a deep irony, considering the whole purpose of Browder's trip to Madrid. I mean, he was there to meet with Spain's top anti-corruption prosecutor.
Right.
His goal was to share evidence about how dirty money from Russian syndicates had been used to buy luxury properties right there on the Spanish coast.
So Browder has a laugh about this ridiculous room, goes to sleep, and wakes up the next morning expecting a pretty standard day of meetings. At 8:15 a.m., he opens his door to head down for breakfast.
Okay.
And standing on the landing is the hotel manager, looking terrified, and he's flanked by two stone-faced Spanish police officers. The charge they read him is based on a Russian Interpol Red Notice.
And we should probably clarify what an Interpol Red Notice actually is because, well, it sounds like an international arrest warrant, but the mechanics are actually a bit different.
Yeah, how does that work?
So Interpol itself doesn't have agents out there kicking down doors. A Red Notice is essentially a global bulletin. It's one member country asking the law enforcement of all other member countries to locate and provisionally arrest a specific person pending extradition.
So it's like an APB for the whole planet.
Exactly. And in a functioning global system, it's used to catch flowing murderers or human traffickers. But autocratic regimes, they've figured out that they can weaponize this system.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they issue red notices to effectively hunt dissidents or political enemies across borders. It forces local police in places like Spain to act as their, unwitting deputies.
Man. So in the blink of an eye, Browder goes from this massive presidential suite to the back of a tiny Peugeot police car. A car with no door handles on the inside, a thick plexiglass divider, and the lingering smell of sweat and urine.
What a contrast.
Right. And as the sirens start blaring, he is struck by this terrifying thought. He's wondering, is this a legitimate administrative arrest by Spanish police?
Yeah.
Or is this an extrajudicial kidnapping orchestrated by the Russian government?
Which is a very valid fear.
Are they driving him to a police station or to a private airstrip to whisk him away to Moscow? And this wasn't paranoia either. He had received dozens of death threats and had even been warned by a U.S. government official that an extrajudicial rendition was being actively planned against him.
Faced with that reality, he makes a really desperate move. He pulls out his phone, which miraculously the officers hadn't confiscated yet.
Thank goodness.
Right. He snaps a photo of the backs of the officers' heads through the plexiglass, and he secretly tweets it out to his 135,000 followers.
Wow.
And that single digital action sparks this immediate international uproar. Within hours, the Spanish authorities realize the warrant is politically motivated and bogus, and they release him.
That is wild. Today, we are taking a deep dive for you into the source material behind this massive geopolitical chase Bill Browder's account in his book, Freezing Order. We are going to unpack exactly how an American-born hedge fund manager ended up as an international fugitive.
It's quite the story.
It really is. It's a true story of a stolen $230 million, a tragically murdered lawyer, and how the global financial system acts as both a weapon for criminals and a tool for justice.
And just as a quick framing note for you listening, before we get into the weeds, we're looking at these events strictly through the lens of Browder's account in the source material provided.
Yes, absolutely.
Our mission here is to explore the mechanics of this chase and the underlying financial systems, not to endorse any specific political viewpoints.
Okay, let's unpack this because it sounds like a Bourne Identity movie, but it's entirely real. And to understand the end of the chase in that Spanish police car, we really have to look at how the hunt began. And surprisingly, it actually doesn't start with international finance.
No, it doesn't. The foundation of Browder's refusal to back down from corrupt billionaires can be traced back to something incredibly small.
Yeah.
A sterling silver flute.
A flute?
Yeah. If you look at his childhood in Chicago in 1975, Browder was an 11-year-old kid walking to school when 3 bigger teenagers cornered him. and they stole his prized possession, which was a flute his uncle had given him.
Oh, man.
When the police eventually caught those kids trying to pawn stolen instruments, most people would have just taken the flute back and moved on. But young Browder insisted on testifying against them in court.
At 11 years old.
At 11 years old. He developed this intense, almost obsessive focus on accountability. He even started hanging out at a local Greek diner called the Agora just to talk to Chicago police officers and collect their daily rap sheets.
Wait, like reading about fugitives and stolen cars over breakfast.
Exactly.
You can totally see how that childhood mindset maps directly onto what happens decades later. So jump to 2007. Browder is in Moscow running the Hermitage Fund, which at one point was the largest foreign investor in Russia.
Right.
But his holding companies are literally stolen by corrupt Russian Interior Ministry cops. Specifically, a lieutenant colonel named Kuznetsov and a major named Karpov. And I really need to understand the mechanism here because, you can't just put a holding company in a duffel bag and walk away with it. How do police officers actually steal a corporate entity?
It's wild. It requires a mix of physical force and bureaucratic forgery. The corrupt officers raided Browder's Moscow office and physically seized the official corporate seals and the founding documents.
The actual stamp.
The actual stamps. In the Russian system at that time, possessing those physical stamps essentially gave you the power to act on behalf of the company.
That is crazy.
So they took those seals, went to the registry office, and re-registered the ownership of Browder's companies into the names of violent ex-convicts.
Just completely hijacked the paperwork.
Completely. And once they controlled the paper entities, they forged massive fake contracts, creating hundreds of millions of dollars in artificial debt. They then used that fake debt to wipe out the company's historical profits on paper.
Okay, I think I see where this is going.
Yeah, the final step was applying to the Russian government for a tax refund based on those quote-unquote losses. They requested a $230 million refund.
Which happened to be the largest tax refund in Russian history.
Yeah.
And it gets approved in a single day on Christmas Eve.
The sheer audacity is staggering.
It really is. And this brings us to Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei is Browder's brilliant Russian lawyer. He's described in the source as a guy who loves classical music, always wears a blue suit and a red tie, and fundamentally believes in the rule of law.
He was a true idealist.
Yeah. So Sergei digs into the paperwork, and he uncovers the entire mechanism of this $230 million fraud. He even proves that this exact same criminal group pulled off an identical $107 million fraud just a year earlier.
He really did his homework.
He did. He gathers all the evidence and reports the crime to the Russian authorities, fully expecting the system to work.
But the reaction from the system reveals the absolute depth of the corruption. Because instead of arresting the thieves, the Russian Interior Ministry, the very people Sergei testified against, they arrest Sergei.
The circular logic of that is mind-boggling. It's like a police department telling you the only person legally allowed to report a stolen car is the car thief. They literally charged Hermitage's lawyers with a crime for reporting the theft of their own companies.
And the consequences were tragic. Sergei is thrown into Butyrka prison, which is one of the most notorious facilities in Russia.
Yeah.
For 358 days, the authorities try to force him to sign a false confession, stating that Browder was the one who orchestrated the theft.
Just relentless pressure.
The conditions are harrowing. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in the dead of the Russian winter. They move him to cells where raw sewage bubbles up from a hole in the floor.
My gosh.
They completely deny him critical medical care when he develops severe pancreatitis. And finally, when his health completely breaks down, instead of treating him, riot guards chain him to a bed and beat him to death with rubber batons.
That is it's utterly heartbreaking. He was only 37 years old.
Yeah.
And the cover-up that follows is immediate and systemic. Within 24 hours of his death, the authorities changed the official cause of death from toxic shock to heart failure.
And they outright refused his family's request for an independent autopsy.
Right. And investigative journalists later uncovered the mechanism behind this institutional silence. Apparently, a $6 million cash bribe was paid to the FSB, the successor to the KGB, specifically to facilitate the cover-up of the fraud and Sergei's arrest.
So after this, Browder makes it his life's mission to go after the people who killed his lawyer. But the immediate problem he faces is, how do you track down ghosts who just stole $230 million and have the backing of a global superpower?
You don't track the ghosts, you track the money.
Exactly. The strategy shifts from tracking the individuals in Russia to tracking the money globally. Browder hires John Moscow, a legendary former prosecutor from the New York District Attorney's Office.
Okay.
And Moscow introduces a very specific legal tool called the Section 1782 subpoena.
I found this part so fascinating because it exposes this hidden layer of the global economy. What exactly does Section 1782 do?
Section 1782 is a provision in Title 28 of the United States Code. It essentially allows a U.S. federal court to order a person or entity residing in the U.S. to produce documents or give testimony for use in a foreign legal proceeding.
Right.
John Moscow realized that almost all international financial transactions rely on the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency.
Okay, so if you want to move big money,
Yeah, if a corrupt Russian official wants to move money from a bank in Moscow to a secret account in Switzerland or Moldova, they can't just send the rubles directly. The transaction has to be converted and cleared in U.S. dollars.
meaning the money has to physically, or at least digitally, touch U.S. soil.
Yeah.
It goes through a correspondent clearing bank in New York, like J.P. Morgan or Citibank, even if it's just for a fraction of a second.
And that fraction of a second is the vulnerability. Because the transaction crosses a server in New York, it leaves a permanent, legally discoverable record under U.S. jurisdiction.
Wow.
John Moscow's core philosophy on this was brilliantly simple. He told Browder, "It's harder to walk across a field of snow with $230 million and not leave a footprint."
I love that analogy. So they use the 1782 subpoenas to get the New York bank data, but it's just a massive haystack of account numbers and timestamps without any context.
Right, it doesn't tell you the whole story.
Exactly. To figure out who actually owns the shell companies receiving the money, they have to look back to Russia. And this is where Browder's forensic analyst, Vadim Kleiner, steps in. Vadim physically goes to the Gorbushka market in Moscow to buy stolen government databases.
It sounds like something out of a spy novel.
It really does. Imagine you're walking through a chaotic shopping mall looking for classified state secrets. You're buying highly sensitive Russian flight records and property deeds out of the back of a kiosk that's also selling, like pirated Fast and Furious DVDs and cheap electronics.
The bureaucracy itself becomes the tool to dismantle the cover-up. Government workers in corrupt systems are often paid very little, which means entire databases are constantly leaked and sold on the black market for extra cash.
Unbelievable.
So Vadim takes these cheap CDs containing flight manifests, vehicle registries, and property deeds, and he cross-references them with the New York clearing bank data.
Now, I want to make sure I understand the exact mechanism of how he did that. Is he just looking for the same names on both lists?
It's much more sophisticated than that. He's looking for temporal patterns.
Okay.
For example, if the New York bank data shows that a massive, unexplained transfer of $5 million moved into a specific Credit Suisse account in Zurich on May 12th, Vadim searches the Gorbushka flight records for May 11th.
Ah, I see.
He looks for any Russian government officials or their family members who flew from Moscow to Zurich the day before the transfer. When the dates, the destinations, and the dollar amounts align, the anonymity of the shell company completely collapses.
That is brilliant. And the massive breakthrough using this method comes from a whistleblower named Alexander Perepilchny. He was a financial advisor to the husband of Olga Stepanova.
And she was the very tax official who rubber-stamped the fraudulent $230 million refund.
Exactly. Perepilchny flees to London and hands Browder the smoking gun. Internal bank statements proving that $11 million of the stolen money went directly to Credit Suisse accounts in Zurich belonging to the tax official's husband.
Huge find.
But I'm stuck on how they actually action this. I mean, you can't just knock on the door of Credit Suisse with a spreadsheet and ask them to hand over a client's money.
You can't. You have to leverage the bank's own compliance regulations against them.
How so?
Well, Browder initially tried to present the evidence directly to a Swiss prosecutor at a conference in Cambridge and was completely ignored. So the strategy had to pivot. He teamed up with a top Swiss criminologist, Mark Pieth, to file a formal public complaint.
Okay.
And simultaneously, they coordinated with an investigative journalist at Barron's to publish the details of the secret accounts. The mechanism here is public exposure.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. Once the Barron's article drops, the bank's internal compliance officers are legally obligated to file a suspicious activity report to avoid being complicit in money laundering. That internal report forces the hand of the Swiss authorities, who then freeze the $11 million.
That is a masterstroke. Uncovering that money trail backed the criminal syndicate into a corner. But instead of surrendering, they launched countermeasures that were incredibly bizarre and, honestly, lethal.
Very lethal.
The Russian government officially claims they solved the $230 million theft. They pin the entire heist on 3 random ex-convicts. But the glaring issue with their story is that all 3 of these men are conveniently dead.
Yeah.
One fell out of a 17-story window, one died of cirrhosis, and one died of heart failure.
It is a morbidly effective bureaucratic strategy. Dead men cannot testify, they cannot contradict the state's narrative, and they certainly cannot defend themselves in court.
It's like this macabre game of musical chairs where the music stops and the losers end up in the morgue. And they didn't just blame the 3 fall guys either. Here's where it gets really interesting. They actually tried to put Sergei Magnitsky on trial after they killed him.
The first posthumous trial in Russian history.
They literally convicted a dead man to justify their cover-up.
This is where we really see the terrifying merger of state and syndicate. Vadim's cross-referencing research revealed that the mastermind behind the scheme was a man named Dmitry Kliyev.
Right. Mob boss.
He was a former Special Forces scout turned mob boss and the owner of the shadowy Universal Savings Bank where the stolen money initially landed. Kliyev personally attended an OSCE human rights conference in Monaco to lobby international politicians against passing anti-corruption laws.
He went to a human rights conference.
Yes. And he didn't sneak into the building. He was wearing an official Russian government badge. The presence of a known organized crime boss acting as a diplomatic emissary demonstrates that the line between the syndicate and the state had been completely erased.
Wow. And Browder was at that exact same conference in Monaco, presenting a documentary exposing Kliyev. While standing in line at the buffet, Browder is bumped into by this striking 6-foot-tall blonde named Svetlana, who claims she works in fashion and is intensely interested in human rights.
A classic setup.
Yeah, she emails him later that night saying she can't stop thinking about him and wants to come to his hotel room. It was a really clumsy honey trap, but the message was chilling. The intelligence services are standing right next to you at the buffet.
And the threat of violence wasn't theoretical at all. Look what happened to Alexander Pereplikny, the whistleblower who provided those Swiss bank records.
Oh, that's right.
The syndicate heavily pressured Pereplikny to recant his testimony. He completely refused. Then, in November 2012, he takes a lavish trip to Paris with his mistress, where he suddenly starts vomiting violently.
Oh, man.
He manages to fly back to his heavily guarded, gated community in the United Kingdom, goes for a jog, and just drops dead.
The detail from the source material that really sticks with me is the neighbor's chef, a former British Special Forces soldier, trying to give Pereplikny CPR on the sidewalk. He noted that green foam was bubbling from Pereplikny's lips, and it tasted like battery acid.
Which was suspected to be a rare, undetectable plant poison.
It's terrifying. So while the bodies were piling up in Europe, the footprint in the snow finally led to American soil. A journalist working with the team, Bill Alpert, discovers a shell company called Privazon.
And Privazon happens to be owned by the son of a senior Russian government official.
Right.
The data showed that Privazon received a portion of the stolen $230 million and used it to go on a Manhattan real estate shopping spree. They bought $17 million in luxury properties, including high-end condos right inside the old J.P. Morgan building at 20 Pine Street.
And because the money was used to buy physical property in New York, the United States suddenly had jurisdiction. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York filed a civil asset forfeiture case, successfully freezing $20 million in assets.
A huge move.
But wait, how does civil asset forfeiture bypass the fact that there is no extradition treaty between the U.S. and Russia?
It relies on a legal concept known as in rem jurisdiction, which basically translates to against the thing. Under U.S. federal civil asset forfeiture laws, the government doesn't have to formally charge or sue the person who committed the crime. They sue the physical property itself, alleging that the real estate is the direct proceed of a crime.
Oh, so they don't need the person.
Exactly. They don't need to drag the Russian official's son into a New York courtroom. They simply seize the luxury condos. It was a massive victory for Browder's team until an unthinkable betrayal occurred.
Yeah, this part is infuriating. The Russian owners of Privazon realized they needed top-tier legal defense in New York. So they hired John Moscow.
The exact same legendary prosecutor who taught Bill Browder how to trace the dollar transfers using the 1782 subpoenas in the first place.
It's like hiring a top-tier security expert to build a vault for your family, only for the bank robbers to hire that exact same expert to give them the blueprints. The danger of this conflict of interest is profound. It's not just that Moscow knows the financial laws. He was the architect of Browder's strategy.
And the conflict of interest is the mechanism of the threat. Because Moscow had previously been Browder's attorney, He possessed intimate knowledge of Browder's vulnerability.
And knew everything.
He knew the names and locations of all the undercover forensic analysts like Vadim Kleiner. He knew the specific methodologies they used to cross-reference data. Most dangerously, he had access to Browder's physical security details.
That is so messed up.
Yet Moscow's law firm, Baker Hostetler, claimed there was no technical conflict, arguing they were formally defending Prevezon against the U.S. government, not directly fighting Browder.
So Browder's new legal team immediately files a motion to disqualify John Moscow. The case is assigned to Judge Thomas Grisa, and the transcripts from these hearings are deeply troubling to read.
They really are.
Judge Grisa was 83 years old at the time and appeared tragically confused by the basic facts of the case. He couldn't remember who Browder was, he couldn't follow the mechanics of the money laundering, and he frequently forgot that the original underlying crime even took place in Russia.
And despite clear evidence that Moscow had previously worked for Browder on this exact matter, the judge ruled in favor of the Russians, allowing Moscow to stay on the case.
Emboldened by that ruling, Moscow's team pivots from defense to offense. They issue devastating subpoenas against Browder, demanding massive amounts of personal information. In doing so, they effectively act as an intelligence-gathering arm for the Russian state.
It's weaponized litigation.
They legally demanded 20 years of his passport copies, all his correspondence with international law enforcement, and 8 years of his personal security details. And to enforce these subpoenas, they hired aggressive process servers to track Browder down physically.
Browder had actually taken his family to Aspen, Colorado, specifically to try and escape the constant threat of being kidnapped or assassinated in London.
Right.
He's attending a conference there, and a man and a woman literally chase him through the rain to throw a subpoena onto the windshield of his moving car.
It's madness. And while Browder is flying back to London, the process servers go to his house in Aspen while his kids are playing outside. They approach his young daughter and ask, "Is your daddy home?"
Yeah.
When she runs inside terrified, they start pounding on the door while his wife and kids literally hide in the basement.
The psychological warfare highlights the profound personal cost of this whole campaign. Browder lived with the constant anxiety of those Interpol red notices, the threat of rendition, and the fear for his family's safety.
Yeah.
At one point, his elderly mother suffered a severe medical emergency back in New Jersey. Because of the aggressive subpoenas John Moscow had issued in New York, Browder's lawyers advised him never to set foot near the jurisdiction. Yet Browder risked being legally served, or worse, just to travel near New York and sit by his dying mother's bedside.
It's an incredible sacrifice. But despite the betrayals, the murdered whistleblowers, the harassment in Aspen, and the constant threat of arrest, the campaign achieved a massive paradigm shift in international law.
It really did.
Armed with the irrefutable data tracing the $230 million theft and the horrific evidence of Sergei Magnitsky's murder, Browder's team successfully lobbied the U.S. Senate. They passed the Magnitsky Act by a vote of 92-4.
And the mechanism of the Magnitsky Act fundamentally changed how the world handles human rights abuses.
How is it different from before?
Well, previously, sanctions were a blunt instrument applied to entire countries, which often devastated innocent citizens while the corrupt elite remained totally insulated.
Right.
The Magnitsky Act allowed the U.S. government to surgically target individual human rights abusers anywhere in the world. It freezes their personal offshore assets and bans their visas, hitting corrupt officials exactly where it hurts: their wallets and their ability to travel to the West.
So a single hedge fund manager and a small team of analysts armed with Excel spreadsheets and an unyielding sense of justice forced the creation of a brand new tool for global accountability.
Which leaves you, the listener, with one final thing to ponder. If a small team could expose the financial vulnerabilities of an autocratic regime to this extent, forcing the creation of new global laws, what does that mean for the billions of dollars of anonymous wealth still circulating through the financial system right now?
That's a great point.
The next time you walk past a glittering, empty luxury high-rise in your city, or you look up at a penthouse that's completely dark, you have to ask yourself, whose footprints are really in the snow, and what crimes paid for the concrete?